My name is Neil Davison. This is my wife Leslie, and we are Megan's parents. Before we begin, it's important for us to stress that we are very conscious of how confronting this issue can be. Our story includes personal details that may be upsetting, and we certainly don't want to cause or trigger any emotional distress. So please take this into consideration before we continue. We'd like to start by thanking the teams at King's College, South London and Maudsley, and Bournemouth for all the essential research work they've been doing into Tide over the past few years. Professor Khalida Ismail at King's was our first point of contact after Megan's death, and we are so grateful for her support and friendship. Thanks also to Sir George Howarth MP, who has been raising awareness of this condition in Parliament for over a decade now, to Jacqueline Allen, the director of the charity Diabetics with Eating Disorders, someone dedicated to fighting for Tide recognition since 2009, to our local MP, Sir Charles Walker, for his continued involvement, to the Eden Unit in Aberdeen for their patient care, and lastly to Diabetes UK for giving us this wonderful opportunity to tell our daughter's story.
Megan was born 31st of August 1989, and on 4th of August 2017, because she felt she was without hope and there was no one to help her, she hung herself. Megan was one of those babies that constantly needed amusing. A one toy at a time so I can really look at it please sort of a child. Strong and robust with hair that grew long, straight, glossy, and so thick I couldn't hold it in one hand to get it into a ponytail. She was a bit of a tomboy, preferring trousers and sweatshirts. She did ballet, brownies, joined a theatre group, and became quite the choreographer for her younger sister and cousin. Loved music from a toddler, often preferring Kate Bush to Postman Pat videos. Megan was intellectually bright, witty and articulate, but could be stubborn and infuriating. On the whole, escaping teenagedom quite lightly, a bit moody but with no dramatic skin or weight problems, Megan had started to blossom when she was diagnosed with type 1 in the April between GCSEs and A-levels, but had refused to seek help until she was skeletal and all but comatose. Our first experience of what we now know to be DKA. Megan became Megan Sugar Davison on Facebook, taking it all in her stride, we thought, and coming across with a few good one-liners. During the next 10 years, we watched her get the best A-level results in her school, decide to be a teacher, get her degree. She chose psychology because she liked to know what made people tick, and Swansea University because it did the right course, she assured us, and not because the campus was practically on the beach. Work full-time for a year before getting her PGCE, and then start teaching at a local junior school. Her dream job, which she carried out in her own unique but very successful style. She met her partner, and they started to make plans together. In 2015, Megan moved into her own home, decorating and sorting it out with enthusiasm, like everything she did, very individual. There we were, thinking job done. Both daughters still talking to us, happy to see us, settled in their own homes. Then on the evening of the 19th of September 2016, I answered the phone, and a woman told me that she was sectioning Megan for her own safety, following an unsuccessful suicide attempt 3 days before. For the last year of her life, Megan was under NHS care. Having seen our daughter brought back from death's door 10 years before, we were at that stage comforted to think that she had been picked up by the system. It was only later we discovered that the lack of understanding surrounding Tide meant our daughter was by no means finding the safe harbour she sought, and the frustration, devastation and destruction that lack of understanding causes. It was then Megan's letter became our starting point.
Our daughter's last words were extensive and provided information that was invaluable in allowing us to process what had happened. For the main part of this presentation, Leslie will now read sections of this suicide letter almost as written, and I will expand on the points raised.
Firstly, I want to tell you all that I'm sorry. This was obviously a huge decision, and I want you to know this wasn't a rash act taken in extreme distress. No one reaching out just in time would have changed my mind or saved my life. It literally would have just meant prolonging my suffering and forcing me to become increasingly deceptive and untruthful, which isn't what I want. My only real hope is that I can at least explain things well enough to offer you some closure, maybe even give information to help other people in the future before they get here. I developed an eating disorder because I wanted to erase myself. Everything was an effort requiring thought and strategy. I skipped meals through a desire to disappear, and like any teenager, my physical appearance began to become entwined with my self-loathing. Once the diabetes came along, I was faced with a life that required my constant vigilance, effort, and care to maintain. It felt like my eating disorder was giddy with joy that I could somehow eat and lose weight.
Dealing with the maintenance of type 1 diabetes can be very stressful, especially through adolescence. It's difficult enough just trying to lead a normal life with social pressures like conformity and body image to consider. But when the psychological aspects of disordered eating and mismanagement of insulin are also involved, then the mix becomes extremely toxic. The physical and mental distress is exacerbated by the frustration through lack of support and understanding of the condition within the medical profession. The pressure becomes unbearable as a consequence, and bad choices are made due to feelings of hopelessness and despair. In Megan's case, she had a pre-existing eating disorder prior to her type 1 diagnosis, and very quickly learnt that by restricting or omitting her insulin, she could basically eat what she wanted and still lose weight. For a while, this gave her some comfort in that she had more freedom in life, but over the years, she became increasingly aware of the damage she was doing to her physical and mental health. This link between insulin abuse and weight control creates an educational dilemma, however, as making an already vulnerable group aware of this association weaponizes them to some degree.
There are thousands and thousands of people out there who actively want life and knew what happiness was before they developed eating disorders or diabetes, but no one is helping them. Their illness isn't even acknowledged. Diabetic doctors tell them they are bad diabetics, and mental health professionals don't know how insulin works. I had to manage my own insulin while on suicide watch because not one member of staff in the ward was even trained to administer insulin, let alone understand it. They missed doses, gave the wrong insulin, and had to wait for me to point out their mistakes. What if someone were intellectually challenged or psychotic? They'd have died under the care of mental health professionals. Even when I was being treated at the eating disorder facility, they gave me back my insulin because they couldn't figure out the doses. It's not good enough. It's the equivalent of giving an alcoholic vodka or a bulimic a bottle of laxatives, claiming ignorance as a valid excuse.
Lots of points to pick up on there. Firstly, TIDE is not officially recognised as a standalone condition by the NHS, and therefore there is not a clear treatment path for recovery. Secondly, if there is to be early intervention as a result of correct diagnosis, then GPs need to understand that insulin mismanagement is self-harming and a major red flag indicator of a serious mental health condition. As far as Megan's sectioning is concerned, she was sent there for her own protection because of a suicide attempt involving an insulin overdose. It seems farcical, therefore, that she should be given control of her intake due to the lack of diabetic expertise on the premises. And lastly, during her 3-month stay at the eating disorder facility, she managed to stockpile sufficient insulin to facilitate her second overdose suicide attempt. Given her medical history, it's irresponsible not to recognise the importance of professional diabetic support. This lack of understanding of TIDE is putting patients at serious risk and has to be addressed if the NHS continues to approve referrals like this.
There needs to be specific inpatient places that take charge of insulin doses and meal plans while people receive their therapy. There needs to be mental health support for every newly diagnosed diabetic, whether they have pre-existing problems or not. There needs to be trained nurses who have expertise in both diabetic care and mental health, or at the very least, some communication between those teams. There are so many people crying out for support because they are dying and they are so desperate to live. It's agonising. I've left some anonymous examples of the pain I've been witnessing in various TIDE support groups online, just to show what other people will continue to go through while I get to escape.
Megan was clearly frustrated by the lack of appropriate care. The need for a multidisciplinary team dealing with all aspects of TIDE has been well documented as the best way to treat the condition. However, having expertise individually is of little benefit if the information is not shared, and advice has to be given with knowledge of how it will impact elsewhere. We appreciate that this is a complicated condition, but that doesn't mean the treatment process has to reflect and accentuate the difficulties. A better understanding of the complexity of TIDE will provide a complementary approach that will increase the chances of recovery. Until there is action taken that brings all elements of this disease together to be treated concurrently and ideally under one roof, existing services will continue to be largely ineffective. It is also recognised that the physical aspects of the condition have to be stabilised before significant psychological progress can be made. Integrated treatment is the way forward, with a healthcare team that agrees a care plan tailored to suit individual needs. This cannot be achieved successfully at present, given the disjointed nature of the care provided.
I had no desire to live, which I suppose might have improved with years of therapy if I hadn't had a chronic illness gnawing away at me. You need to want life to be motivated to manage diabetes, but I'd need to manage my diabetes to live long enough to even have a chance of wanting life. Complete catch-22. The future was just bleak and filled with psychological and physical pain. The complications of poorly managed diabetes would definitely kill me sooner or later, and my life still had no upside or purpose. So why not check out early? I was only carrying on to save other people's pain, but my pain began to look more and more severe and therefore took priority.
The extent of Megan's desperation is evident. Although her learnt behaviours and health choices were detrimental to her general well-being, while she still had some control, the pretense could continue. However, she sadly realised that things had deteriorated to such a degree that a critical decision had to be made. Those closest to her could see she was spiralling out of control, and Megan couldn't see any light at the end of a very dark tunnel.
I was cycling in and out of A&E in DKA, constantly in pain from binging and purging food, dehydrated, constantly exhausted, anxious going out into the world, desperate to shut myself away, embarrassed by psoriasis and scars, facing a double mastectomy that had been misdiagnosed for over a year, slowly damaging my eyes. I could go on. Bit by bit, my strategy of just getting through was becoming harder and more distressing. Even the professionals could only use words like manage or cope, which is fine if by managing you actually gain something out of life. But life just made me miserable. I would be struggling for nothing. I know it's a selfish position. I just really hope I can help you to understand enough to limit any feelings of anger or guilt.
TIDE is a condition that adversely affects both physical and mental health. The severity of wide-ranging medical complications is determined by how long the insulin abuse has been going on and the extent of the restriction. As far as patient compliance is concerned, we ask you to consider Megan's state of mind when confronted with the need to attend appointments supposedly assisting her recovery, and also the treatment required to deal with adverse consequences. If the NHS expectation is that a TIDE sufferer will respond favourably to a medical path that requires them to travel all over the county and beyond, then they are sorely mistaken. If anything, it makes the problem worse, as someone's poor health cannot possibly be well served by having to attend multi-appointments in different locations. In addition to that, some of the advice given is contradictory, accentuating the feelings of hopelessness. Taking food as an example, and quoting from the Diabetes UK position statement, standard treatments for eating disorders are not usually appropriate for TIDE. Treatment for eating disorders tend to involve removing the focus on food, which is of course contrary to recommended advice for management of type 1 diabetes. So all the different strands of the condition can become entwined in a counterproductive way if there is no real awareness of the need to share treatment information. Given these circumstances, it is understandable that so many appointments are missed and that TIDE sufferers are disillusioned by the whole process. This adds to their emotional distress and affects their willingness to engage elsewhere.
As far as my funeral is concerned, please don't let anyone waste money on floral tributes. Khalida Ismail seems to be the only doctor currently fighting for TIDE, so maybe she would like some funding.
Megan had done her own research into the condition and became aware of the work being done at King's College Hospital. When we contacted Khalida and gave her the sad news, she told us about a TIDE documentary that she'd just been involved in with the BBC. She spoke to the programme makers on our behalf, and as a result, we were subsequently invited to appear on the Victoria Derbyshire show. Talking about Megan on TV gave us the opportunity to meet Dr. Jane Morris, who was representing the Eden unit in Aberdeen. At the time, this eating disorder facility was the only one in the UK treating TIDE on an inpatient basis. Although research and pilot scheme initiatives are currently treating in this way, if there is no further funding, then this essential work will stop. It is unacceptable to think that could be the case, bearing in mind that Aberdeen can only accept Scottish patients due to demand. The BBC Three documentary referred to is called Diabulimia, the world's most dangerous eating disorder, and should still be available to view online, so we urge you to watch it for further information about this condition.
I chose to work the system in order to slip through it, and it was unbelievably easy.
I think it's fair to say that Megan knew a lot more about TIDE than the majority of the healthcare professionals treating her. This gave her the luxury of telling people what they needed to hear so that she could extricate herself from proceedings. It also meant that when assessments were being made, she always gave the impression that she had mental capacity. Just a few days before she took her own life, having requested discharge from all NHS services, she was deemed to have capacity at her CPA meeting. Even though there were a series of red flags indicating otherwise, the professional appraisal was that Megan was not in any immediate danger. When you consider that the decision to discharge her was partly made by a doctor who admitted at the coroner's inquest that she knew nothing about TIDE, it's clear that risk assessments are flawed if those involved have insufficient knowledge of the condition. Megan succeeded in working the system and slipping through it, but surely it's the responsibility of this system to be fit for purpose so that important judgments are at least informed ones.
I can honestly say that I've loved you all with all my heart and up to my very last breath. Thank you for packing so much light into a life that was only going to become darker with time. I've genuinely been blessed to be protected and comforted by you all for so many years. With love always, Megan.
Our daughter was telling us that things would have been much worse for her if she'd carried on. We knew how distressed she was towards the end, so had to respect the decision she'd made. Megan took the opportunity to explain her reasoning in great detail, and we took comfort from the fact that her suffering was over.
Neil and I realised more research and funding were vital, but what we had seen convinced us that effective use of the money already in the system would surely provide some of the answers. Before the end of 2019, we tried to get as much factual information as we could via Megan's medical records, freedom of information requests, and anything else we could think of. This is the resulting breakdown of costs to the NHS just for the last year of our daughter's life.
We know of 6 DKA episodes, and at an estimated £2,500 per admission, the cost to the NHS was around £15,000. There were 2 hospital admissions due to her suicide attempts. Megan spent a total of 5 days in intensive care, and at approximately £2,000 per day, that's another £10,000. When she was sectioned and subsequently spent 3 months at an eating disorder facility, the total cost of that inpatient treatment was approximately £48,000. Then there's many missed appointments, costing the NHS around £30 each time, plus insulin wastage through restriction and omission. And lastly, the expense involved in treating all the different aspects of this condition.
We believe that last year of Megan's life must have cost the NHS at least £100,000. If Megan hadn't taken her life, how many times do you multiply that amount as medical complications worsen? In addition to that, she was paid while off sick for several months, received PIP of about £3,000 and had £25,000 student loan written off. Megan was a good teacher. Parents would ask for children to go into her class. A lot of children will not be taught by her now. She wasn't at her best friend's wedding, and her partner will never see the house they had so carefully planned together. While those are the true losses, you cannot put a price on them, and in the real world, money talks. So we've researched the hard cash because we know it's the bottom line that gets things done.
What has to be considered here is how much of that estimated £100,000 was wasted expense to the NHS. We've tried to highlight the inadequacies of the current system, and for us it's about how existing money can be better spent in relation to the demands of TIDE. If you look at the frequency of Megan's DKA presentations, for example, This is the biggest indicator of insulin abuse and requires life-saving attention. We have had difficulty accessing details of admissions as records vary wildly from hospital to hospital. However, we have had sufficient response through freedom of information requests to indicate that an average of 2 admissions per week are made to UK A&Es, and at an estimated cost of £2,500 per episode, then this equates to £25 million per annum. Therefore, any significant reduction in DKA admissions as a result of better Tide care would drastically reduce that particular financial burden.
Because Tide is not recognised and no official figures are kept, we can only tell an individual story, and every story is going to be different. But the increasing complications, additional referrals, lying, and eventual spiralling out of control are likely to be common. Early intervention by an NHS system that recognises and understands Tide is crucial. Patients cannot be expected to deal with contradictory advice and multi-locational appointments when they are at their most vulnerable and looking for reasons not to help themselves. From what we have seen and discovered from the research we have done, not recognising or treating Tide doesn't mean the NHS isn't spending money on this condition. It just means the NHS has no idea how much money it is spending badly. It isn't a question of can the NHS afford to recognise and deal with Tide. The question is, how can it possibly afford not to?
Reading through some Diabetes UK information we were given, there is mention of pockets of good Tide practice in different parts of the UK, some of whom will be represented here today. However, the limited extent of this coverage highlights the problem of access to condition-specific services for the majority of sufferers. Where we're from in Hertfordshire, for example, there is a new integrated service, but only in the West. If Megan were alive today, she would still not be eligible for this treatment, as there is no such initiative for the rest of the county. We appreciate that there are healthcare professionals listening who work in facilities that are more Tide aware. We know that the experience we've had with our daughter is just a snapshot of a much bigger picture, and that treatment varies from area to area. However, that in itself is part of the problem, and it's ridiculous that area dictates the level of the care provided. If the NHS were to officially recognise this condition as a separate entity, then that inconsistency could be eradicated and national treatment protocols could be put in place.
No doctor should have to treat the same patient twice for DKA within 48 hours, knowing they will be coming back again because there is nowhere to send them for help. We want other sons and daughters to attend their best friends' weddings, live in the house they've planned for all those future teachers, plasterers, gardeners or doctors to fulfil their potential. We have set up these contact details for anyone wanting to comment or ask questions about any issues we've raised. Neil and I will continue to try and raise the profile of Tide wherever possible, with those invested in moving this on constructively. If you think we can help in any capacity, then please let us know, as we're always looking for different ways of getting the message out there.
This picture is of Megan with her younger sister. Our daughter Olivia has been so supportive throughout and has dealt with this tragedy incredibly well. We are so proud of her, and she is a daily reminder of how precious the lives of all our children are.
We were lucky that Megan's first suicide attempts were unsuccessful, because apart from protecting us from the total shock a successful first attempt would have been, it let us into the world of frustration that she had been experiencing. So we began in some small way to understand. In the end, we were immensely proud that she had tried to protect us for as long as she did, and that she had achieved so much in spite of Tide.
Thank you for listening.
This has meant so much to us.